The first lock I saw in my garage wasn't there to stop thieves. It was there to stop me. And it was installed by the HOA president herself, like she was playing some kind of ultimate power challenge game. The story I'm about to tell you is about locks, a spectacular pink explosion, and why my HOA now needs to hire a full-time lawyer. And hey, before we dive into this drama, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I bet some of you are dealing with your own HOA nightmares right now. My name is Eric Dalton, and I'm a 32-year-old IoT engineer who thought he'd found paradise when I moved to Glen Haven Harmony. This wasn't just any suburban development. It marketed itself as a 100% eco-synchronized community where nature and neighbors supposedly lived in perfect harmony. As someone who drives a Tesla Model 3 and actually cares about reducing my carbon footprint, Glen Haven seemed like the perfect fit. The HOA fees were steep at $250 a month, but I figured it was worth it for a community that shared my values. What the brochures didn't mention was Sandra Crawford. Sandra was our HOA president, a 38-year-old former corporate compliance officer who treated environmental consciousness like a weapon. She had that earth-tone blazer look with little leaf pins, always carrying a clipboard made from recycled materials, and that plastic smile that somehow managed to look both friendly and predatory at the same time. At first glance, she seemed like the kind of person you'd want leading an eco-friendly community. That first impression lasted exactly 3 weeks. The trouble started when I decided to install a Tesla charging station in my garage. I researched every single HOA guideline, checked local building codes, and hired a licensed electrician to ensure everything was up to standard. The installation was clean, professional, and completely within my property lines. I thought I'd covered all my bases. I was wrong. Sandra showed up at my door on a sunny Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand and that plastic smile. "Hi there, Eric. I hope you don't mind me stopping by, but I noticed some activity around your garage area. As HOA president, I like to stay informed about any modifications our residents are making." Her voice had that sweet, sing-song quality that immediately put me on edge, but I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe this was just standard community oversight. I walked her over to the garage and showed her the charging station, explaining the technical specifications and how it met all the safety requirements. Sandra nodded along, taking notes on her clipboard and asking questions that seemed reasonable at first. "How often will you be charging? What's the voltage impact on the neighborhood grid? Are there any light reflection effects we should be concerned about?" I answered everything thoroughly, even showing her the documentation from the electrician and the permit from the city. I thought I was being a model resident. Then Sandra dropped the first hint of what was coming. "You know, Eric, Glen Haven has very specific guidelines about maintaining our environmental harmony. Any modification that could potentially impact our community's eco-balance needs to go through our Environmental Impact Assessment Committee." I'd never heard of this committee, and it wasn't mentioned in any of the HOA documents I'd received. When I asked about it, Sandra waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, it's a newer initiative. We're always evolving our environmental standards. I'm sure it's just a formality, but we want to ensure everything aligns with our zero-carbon vision." The way she said zero carbon vision made it sound like she was announcing the second coming of environmental salvation. I should have recognized the warning signs right then. The vague committee that didn't exist in any official documentation, the pseudo-scientific language about eco-balance, and that particular gleam in her eyes when she talked about standards. But I was still operating under the assumption that I was dealing with a reasonable person who genuinely cared about the environment. Sandra asked me to temporarily refrain from using the charging station until the committee could review it. When I pointed out that I needed to charge my car to get to work, she suggested I could use public charging stations or consider carpooling to reduce my overall carbon footprint. The suggestion was absurd. The nearest public charging station was 15 miles away, and there was no one in Glen Haven who worked anywhere near my office. But Sandra seemed so earnest in her environmental concern that I agreed to hold off for a few days while she got the committee together. I went to bed that night thinking I'd handled the situation perfectly. I'd been cooperative, informative, and patient with what seemed like a minor bureaucratic hurdle. I figured Sandra would eventually realize that a home charging station actually supported the community's environmental goals and we'd move forward without any issues. I was so naive. The next morning, I walked into my garage to grab some tools and stopped dead in my tracks. There, attached to my charging port with what looked like a heavy-duty master lock, was a piece of industrial hardware that definitely hadn't been there the night before. Staring at that lock was like being slapped awake from a pleasant dream. This wasn't some minor misunderstanding or bureaucratic oversight. This was a deliberate act of sabotage. The lock itself was a serious piece of hardware, the kind used on construction sites and storage facilities, not something you'd casually have lying around in your garage. Someone had planned this, purchased the lock specifically for this purpose, and felt entitled enough to come onto my property and install it without permission. I knew exactly who that someone was. My first instinct was to call Sandra directly. When she answered her phone, her voice had that same sweet, helpful tone from the day before. "Oh, Eric, I'm so glad you called. I was just thinking about your charging station situation." I described what I'd found, trying to keep my voice level and professional. There was a pause, and then Sandra's response made my blood pressure spike. "Oh my, that must be the temporary protective measure we discussed. Our environmental safety protocol requires us to secure any potentially hazardous equipment until it can be properly assessed." Environmental safety protocol. Another committee or policy that had never been mentioned in any official HOA documentation. I asked Sandra for the key to the lock, explaining that I needed to charge my car to get to work. Her response was a masterclass in polite stonewalling. "I understand your frustration, Eric, but I can't authorize removal of safety equipment until our assessment is complete. Have you considered the environmental benefits of reducing your daily driving?" The conversation lasted 20 more minutes, with Sandra deflecting every direct question with environmental platitudes. With my Tesla locked up and useless, I had to call a rideshare to get to work. The round trip cost me $65, which would have been annoying enough as a one-time expense. But it became clear this wasn't going to be resolved quickly. That afternoon, I sent Sandra a formal written request for removal of the lock, citing the specific sections of our HOA bylaws that protected property owners' rights to make approved modifications. I included documentation proving that my charging station met all local building codes and had been installed with proper permits. I kept the tone professional but firm, making it clear that I expected prompt resolution. Sandra's response came the next day in the form of an email announcing an emergency community meeting to discuss unauthorized high-tech modifications and their impact on Glen Haven's environmental mission. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening, and attendance was strongly encouraged for all residents concerned about maintaining our community's ecological harmony. It was obvious that Sandra was turning my charging station into a public spectacle, probably hoping that community pressure would force me to back down. That's when I started documenting everything. I took photographs of the lock from multiple angles, printed and filed every email exchange with Sandra, and started keeping a detailed log of all interactions with HOA leadership. I also began researching Sandra's background and the legal framework governing HOA operations in our state. What I found was enlightening and more than a little disturbing. My next-door neighbor, Jerry Thompson, turned out to be an invaluable source of information. Jerry was a 45-year-old electrical technician who'd been living in Glen Haven for 5 years, long enough to have witnessed Sandra's rise to power. Over beers on his back patio, Jerry shared stories that painted a very different picture of our HOA president. "She did the same thing to my outdoor ceiling fan last summer," Jerry told me, shaking his head, claimed it was disrupting natural airflow patterns and affecting local birds. Made me take it down and threatened fines if I put it back up. Jerry's fan wasn't the only victim. There was the resident who was forced to remove solar panels because they created visual disruption, and another neighbor who'd been fined for using LED lights because they didn't provide natural spectrum illumination. The Thursday evening meeting was held in the community center, and about 30 residents showed up, which was apparently a record for HOA meetings in Glen Haven. Sandra had prepared a presentation, complete with printed handouts and charts that looked impressive until you realized they were completely meaningless. She spent 20 minutes explaining how charging stations could potentially disrupt electromagnetic harmony in residential environments, and showed pictures of birds that she claimed were being affected by artificial energy fields from electric vehicles. It was complete nonsense, but Sandra delivered it with such conviction and wrapped it in enough environmental jargon that several residents seemed genuinely concerned. When she opened the floor for questions, I stood up and calmly presented the actual facts about electric vehicle charging, the environmental benefits compared to gasoline engines, and the complete lack of scientific evidence for any of Sandra's claims. I could see a few residents nodding along, but Sandra quickly regained control of the narrative by pivoting to concerns about precedent-setting modifications and the need to maintain community standards. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Sandra had no intention of unlocking my charging station. She'd successfully reframed the issue from HOA president illegally restricting residents' property rights to community decides whether to allow disruptive technology, The lock would stay in place pending further environmental assessment, which could take weeks or months. I walked out of that meeting knowing I was in for a fight, but I still believed it would be resolved through reasonable discussion and proper channels. I was about to learn just how wrong I could be. The first week of charging station lockdown was frustrating but manageable. $65 a day in rideshare costs was expensive, but I figured it was temporary. Sandra would eventually have to admit that her environmental concerns were baseless, or the other residents would get tired of the drama and pressure her to be reasonable. I kept documenting everything, responding to her emails with facts and citations, and maintaining the high road in all our interaction. I was convinced that logic and patience would eventually prevail. That optimism lasted exactly until 2 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. I woke up to complete darkness. Not the normal darkness of nighttime, but the absolute black that comes when every electronic device in your house suddenly dies. My phone was still working on battery power, so I used its flashlight to investigate. The digital clocks were all blank, the refrigerator had stopped humming, and when I checked the electrical panel, I found that the main breaker to my garage had been switched off. Not tripped, switched off, which meant someone had deliberately cut power to that part of my house. In the garage, the situation was even worse. My home office setup, which I'd moved there to create more space in the house, was completely dead. The server that I used for work projects was down, along with 2 expensive monitors and a workstation that contained weeks of unsaved progress on a client project. The freezer that held $300 worth of food had been without power for who knows how long, and everything inside was already starting to thaw. The smell hit me immediately, that sickly sweet odor of spoiling meat and melting ice cream. The electrical panel in the garage showed that the main line had been switched off from outside the house. In Glenhaven, the HOA maintained control over certain utility connections as part of their integrated community infrastructure management. It was supposed to be used only for emergencies or major maintenance, but technically Sandra had the authority to cut power to any part of any residence if she deemed it necessary for community safety. The lock on my charging station was looking less and less like an isolated incident. I called Sandra's cell phone at 2:30 in the morning, and she answered on the second ring as if she'd been expecting my call. "Eric, I hope everything's okay. I got an automated alert about a potential electrical issue at your address." The concern in her voice was so obviously fake that it was almost insulting. When I explained about the power outage, Sandra made sympathetic noises about aging electrical infrastructure and the importance of safety protocols. She promised to have someone look into it first thing in the morning, but suggested that I might want to consider whether my high-power charging equipment was putting too much strain on the neighborhood grid. The next day brought a maintenance worker who discovered that my garage electrical system needed urgent safety upgrades before power could be restored. The work would take 3 to 5 business days and cost approximately $2,000, which wouldn't be covered by HOA maintenance funds, because it was related to resident-installed equipment modification. Sandra delivered this news with the same helpful smile she'd used when first discussing my charging station, as if she were doing me a favor by identifying these critical safety issues. That's when I finally understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't about environmental protection or community standards, it was about control, pure and simple. Sandra had found a way to use her position to punish anyone who didn't immediately comply with her demands, and she was willing to cause thousands of dollars in damage to make her point. The environmental rhetoric was just window dressing on what was essentially a power trip disguised as community leadership. I spent the next 2 days taking unpaid leave from work while trying to salvage what I could from my ruined equipment and spoiled food. The financial damage was approaching $5,000, and I was facing the possibility of missing important project deadlines that could affect my professional reputation. For the first time since this whole mess started, I found myself seriously considering just giving up. Maybe Sandra was right about precedent-setting modifications. Maybe it would be easier to just sell the house and move somewhere with a less insane HOA. Maybe the fight wasn't worth the cost. That's when Rachel Monroe knocked on my door. Rachel was a 29-year-old environmental lawyer who lived 3 houses down from me, and I'd seen her at a few community events but never really talked to her. She'd heard about my situation through the neighborhood gossip network and wanted to offer her professional perspective. Over coffee at my kitchen table, Rachel explained that what Sandra was doing wasn't just unreasonable, it was probably illegal. Environmental protection is a legitimate concern for HOAs, Rachel told me, but it has to be based on actual environmental science, not made-up policies that target specific residents. The selective enforcement is particularly problematic from a legal standpoint. If Sandra is allowing other residents to use technology that she's banning for you, that's discrimination. And cutting off your power without proper notice or due process, that's almost certainly a violation of your property rights. Rachel offered to help me document Sandra's pattern of abuse and explore legal options for fighting back. But as we talked, I found myself thinking about my college days and the performance art installations I used to create. Back then, I'd been passionate about using creativity to expose hypocrisy and challenge authority in ways that pure logic couldn't achieve. I'd once turned an entire gallery into a statement about corporate environmental greenwashing, using interactive displays that revealed the gap between companies' public messaging and their actual practices. Maybe it was time to dust off some of those old skills. That evening, I walked through my powerless garage, looking at the damaged equipment and ruined food, and felt something shift in my mindset. Sandra wanted to play power games using environmental rhetoric as cover? Fine. But she'd made a crucial mistake. She'd picked a fight with someone who understood both technology and the art of creative resistance. I wasn't going to just fight this battle in boardrooms. I was going to make it personal, memorable, and absolutely impossible for her to ignore. I started that night by sketching out plans for what I privately called Project Pink Justice. If Sandra was going to keep playing the role of environmental dictator, I was going to give her a performance she'd never forget. The best part was that it would be completely legal, entirely on my own property, and perfectly in keeping with the community's supposed commitment to creative expression and environmental consciousness. Sandra had no idea what she'd just unleashed, but she was about to find out exactly what happens when you push an engineer with an art school background too far. Designing the perfect revenge required balancing three critical elements: technical precision, artistic impact, and legal protection. As someone who'd spent years working with IoT sensors and automation systems, I had the technical skills. My background in performance art gave me the creative vision, and Rachel's legal expertise helped ensure that whatever I built would be defensible in court. The result was something I privately called the pressure-activated paint burst system, a masterpiece of engineering that would have made my art school professors proud. The concept was elegantly simple. I would install pressure sensors around my charging station, connected to a controller and a pneumatic paint delivery system. Any unauthorized attempt to manipulate the lock would trigger the sensors, activating a mechanism that would spray whoever was tampering with my property. The paint I selected was a UV-reactive magenta compound that would glow bright pink under daylight and become even more vivid under blacklight. It wasn't permanent, but it would take weeks to fully fade, and anyone tagged by it would be impossible to miss. Jerry Thompson was invaluable during the construction phase. His electrical expertise helped me integrate the system with my garage's power supply, and his enthusiasm for what he called our art project made the work feel like a collaboration rather than a solo mission. "You know what I love about this?" Jerry said while we were testing the mechanism. "It's not destructive, it's not dangerous, but it's going to make one hell of a statement. Sometimes you need creativity to get people's attention when logic isn't working." The system had to be sensitive enough to detect someone manipulating the lock, but not so sensitive that it would be triggered by normal vibrations or weather conditions. The paint delivery needed enough pressure to ensure complete coverage, but not so much that it could cause injury. The timing had to be perfect. A delay of even half a second could mean the difference between tagging Sandra and missing her entirely. We spent 2 weeks fine-tuning every component until it worked flawlessly. The legal research was equally important. Rachel helped me understand what I could legally do on my own property in response to ongoing trespassing and property damage. "The key is proportional response," she explained. "You can defend your property, but you can't set traps that could cause serious injury. Paint that washes off, activated only when someone is tampering with your equipment, that's probably defensible as a deterrent system." We documented everything carefully, creating a paper trail showing my system was a response to Sandra's escalating harassment. While I was building my artistic booby trap, Sandra was escalating her own campaign. She'd somehow discovered that I was still charging my Tesla at the office, and this apparently constituted a new violation of Glenhaven's environmental principles. I received a formal citation for circumventing community sustainability protocols, along with a fine of $500 per day for ongoing environmental noncompliance. The citation was signed by Sandra and 2 other board members representing what she called the Emergency Environmental Enforcement Committee. Installation took place over a weekend when Sandra was out of town visiting her sister in Portland. Jerry and I worked carefully, hiding the sensors and paint reservoirs where they wouldn't be visible during casual observation, but would provide optimal coverage when activated. The controller was concealed in a weatherproof case that looked like standard garage equipment. High-definition cameras were positioned to capture everything from multiple angles, ensuring that when the system eventually triggered, we'd have comprehensive documentation. The testing phase was crucial and slightly terrifying. We used washable paint for initial tests, setting up cardboard targets to simulate Sandra's approximate height and positioning. The system worked flawlessly, delivering a satisfying burst of paint that completely covered our test targets in less than 2 seconds. The coverage pattern was artistic in its completeness. Whoever triggered this system would be painted from head to toe, with no possibility of avoiding the colorful consequences. The waiting period was the hardest part. Every morning I'd check the cameras and sensors, looking for signs that Sandra had visited my garage overnight. The system was armed and ready, but I knew that Sandra's controlling personality wouldn't let her resist checking on her handiwork indefinitely. She'd want to inspect the lock, make sure it was still secure, probably take photos to document my ongoing non-compliance. It was just a matter of time. Meanwhile, the daily fines continued accumulating. Sandra sent increasingly aggressive letters about my willful environmental violations and refusal to cooperate with community sustainability initiatives. She'd also started making noises about placing a lien on my house if the fines weren't paid within 30 days. The total amount owed was approaching $8,000, which was both financially painful and legally questionable. Rachel was preparing a formal challenge to the fines, but we both knew that Sandra would keep escalating until something forced her to stop. That something was about to be a spectacular explosion of UV reactive magenta paint, triggered by Sandra's own compulsive need to control every aspect of her neighbors' lives. I knew she wouldn't be able to resist the temptation to check on the lock, to make sure her power play was still in effect. When she did, she was going to get the most colorful surprise of her life, and Glen Haven Harmony would never be quite the same. The only question was when Sandra's curiosity would finally spring the trap I'd so carefully prepared for her. The morning Sandra Crawford got painted was a Tuesday, and it started like any other day in Glen Haven Harmony. I was having coffee in my kitchen, reviewing some code for a client project, when the motion detection alert started pinging on my phone. The timestamp showed 7:15 a.m., and the camera feeds revealed Sandra approaching my garage with her signature clipboard and what looked like a measuring tape. She was wearing a bright yellow blazer that would soon be providing an interesting contrast to UV reactive magenta paint. I quickly switched to the live camera feed and watched Sandra circle my charging station like a predator sizing up her prey. She took photos from multiple angles, made notes on her clipboard, and then began examining the lock she'd installed. This was exactly the behavior I'd been waiting for. Sandra couldn't resist the opportunity to inspect her handiwork, to confirm that her authority was still being respected. Her compulsive need for control was about to become very expensive from a dry cleaning perspective. The moment of truth came when Sandra decided to test the security of her lock. Instead of just looking at it, she grabbed the master lock and gave it a firm shake to make sure it was still properly attached to my charging port. That motion triggered the pressure sensors, and the controller immediately activated the pneumatic paint delivery system. There was a brief hissing sound as compressed air forced magenta paint through carefully positioned nozzles, and then Sandra Crawford disappeared in a cloud of bright pink mist. The explosion was even more spectacular than I'd hoped. The paint coverage was absolutely complete. Sandra was coated from her perfectly styled hair down to her sensible shoes. The UV reactive compounds made the magenta glow with an almost supernatural brightness in the morning sunlight. She looked like she'd been dipped in the world's most vibrant paint bucket, and the contrast with her yellow blazer created a color combination that was visible from 3 blocks away. Sandra's immediate reaction was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd just been transformed into a walking piece of performance art. She started screaming about assault and booby traps, but the effect was somewhat diminished by the fact that her voice was coming from what appeared to be a very angry hot pink sculpture. I gave her about 30 seconds to process what had happened, then casually walked out of my house with my coffee mug, wearing my best expression of innocent concern. "Oh my goodness, Sandra, what happened? Are you okay?" I kept my voice perfectly level, as if discovering the HOA president covered in bright pink paint was just another Tuesday morning occurrence. "It looks like you've had some kind of accident. Should I call someone?" The cameras were recording everything, and I wanted to make sure my response was completely appropriate and helpful. After all, I was just a concerned neighbor trying to assist someone who'd obviously encountered some kind of mishap. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. Sandra demanded that someone call 911, but when the police arrived, they found it difficult to take her complaint seriously. The paint was obviously harmless, messy, and embarrassing, but not dangerous. The system had been triggered on my own property by someone who was trespassing and tampering with equipment they had no legal right to touch. The officers took statements from everyone involved, but it was clear they viewed this as a civil matter rather than a criminal assault. Within hours, videos of Sandra's pink transformation were circulating through Glenhaven's private messaging groups, and the community reaction was overwhelmingly supportive, though most residents were careful not to express their opinions too openly. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before were reaching out to share their own stories of Sandra's environmental tyranny and to express their appreciation for someone finally standing up to her. The incident quickly became a symbol of resistance to HOA overreach, and residents who'd been quietly suffering under Sandra's arbitrary rules were suddenly feeling empowered to push back. Sandra's response was predictably authoritarian. She immediately called another emergency meeting, this time focused on dangerous residents and threats to community safety. She wanted to discuss new rules about security systems and defensive modifications that would essentially ban any technology that could be used to resist her authority. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and attendance was now mandatory for all residents concerned about maintaining order in Glenhaven Harmony. But something had shifted in the community dynamics. The pink paint incident had shown that Sandra wasn't invincible, that her environmental rhetoric could be challenged, and that creative resistance was possible. For the first time since moving to Glenhaven, I felt like I wasn't fighting Sandra alone. Jerry was organizing what he called informal discussions about community governance, and Rachel was fielding questions about residents' legal rights. Sandra might have been planning her counterattack, but she was no longer operating from a position of unquestioned authority. The pink paint had broken the spell of environmental correctness that she'd used to justify her control over the community, and Glenhaven's residents were waking up to the fact they'd been manipulated by someone who cared more about power than the planet. The week following Sandra's pink paint shower brought a flurry of activity that revealed just how deep her web of control extended through Glenhaven Harmony. While Sandra was presumably getting professional help removing UV reactive magenta from her hair, I was working with Rachel to investigate the legal and financial structures that had allowed her to accumulate so much unchecked power. What we discovered was far more sophisticated and disturbing than simple HOA overreach. Sandra had been running a carefully orchestrated scheme that used environmental rhetoric to cover large-scale financial manipulation. Rachel's investigation started with a simple question: where was Glenhaven's monthly HOA fee money actually going? $250 per month from 87 households should have generated over $200,000 annually, but the community's financial statements showed only basic maintenance expenses, and Sandra's modest salary as HOA president, the math didn't add up, and Rachel's legal training had taught her that when HOA finances don't make sense, there's usually fraud involved. The breakthrough came when Rachel obtained copies of Sandra's correspondence with the State Environmental Agency. Buried in routine filings, she found references to a zero-carbon community model grant program that offered up to $2.5 million for communities that could demonstrate comprehensive environmental integration and aesthetic uniformity. The grant requirements were very specific. Participating communities had to show technology minimal environments, unified visual standards, and resident compliance with sustainable living protocols. Suddenly, Sandra's seemingly random environmental crusades made perfect sense. Every arbitrary rule she'd imposed, every resident she'd targeted for violations, every piece of technology she'd banned, it was all designed to create the appearance of a community that met the state grant requirements. Sandra wasn't a deluded environmental extremist. She was a calculating fraudster, using fake environmentalism to qualify Glenhaven for millions in state funding that she could then control and potentially embezzle. The grant application documents were even more damning. Sandra had listed herself as Community Environmental Coordinator, with a proposed annual salary of $150,000, plus administrative fees that would have given her control over most of the grant money. She'd submitted photographs of Glenhaven that carefully avoided showing any of the modern technology that residents actually used, creating a false impression of a community that had voluntarily embraced pre-digital living. The application even included testimonials from residents that had been fabricated or taken completely out of context. But the most shocking discovery was Sandra's own violation of every environmental rule she'd imposed on everyone else. Using a drone that Jerry had borrowed from his nephew, we captured aerial footage of Sandra's property that revealed a sophisticated smart home setup that would have made a tech enthusiast jealous. Her roof was covered with a mesh network of routers and signal boosters that provided high-speed internet throughout her house. Solar panels that she'd forced other residents to remove were prominently installed on the south-facing side of her roof. LED grow lights for an indoor garden were visible through windows that she kept covered during the day to hide them from neighbors. The evidence of Sandra's hypocrisy was overwhelming, but Rachel warned me that exposing it would require careful handling. She's going to claim that her setup is necessary for her work as HOA president, or that she has special exemptions for environmental monitoring equipment, Rachel explained. We need to document not just what she has, but the pattern of selective enforcement that shows she's using her position for personal benefit while denying the same rights to other residents. That's when other Glen Haven residents started coming forward with their own stories. Jerry had kept detailed records of his interactions with Sandra, including emails where she had demanded removal of his ceiling fan while simultaneously asking for his help installing additional ventilation equipment at her own house. Martha Henderson, who lived on Maple Street, had been forced to replace her efficient LED outdoor lighting with less effective incandescent bulbs, while Sandra's property featured bright LED security lights that violated her own natural spectrum illumination requirements. The pattern of corruption extended beyond just environmental rules. Sandra had been using her position to direct HOA maintenance contracts to companies that gave her kickbacks, inflating repair costs and scheduling unnecessary work to generate higher fees. She'd created fake committees with official-sounding names to justify decisions that she was making unilaterally. The Environmental Impact Assessment Committee that had supposedly been reviewing my charging station didn't exist except as Sandra's personal rubber stamp for whatever she wanted to do. Most disturbing was Sandra's systematic intimidation of residents who questioned her authority. She'd been using the threat of fines and liens to silence opposition, knowing that most people couldn't afford to fight her in court, even when her actions were clearly illegal. The daily $500 fines she'd imposed on me weren't unusual. She'd done the same thing to at least 6 other residents over the past 2 years, collecting thousands of dollars in penalties for violations of rules that she'd made up or selectively enforced. As Rachel compiled this evidence into a comprehensive legal brief, I was working on my own investigation, using the technical skills that had gotten me into this mess in the first place. The camera system I'd installed to document Sandra's paint shower had been recording everything that happened around my garage for weeks. When I reviewed the footage, I found multiple instances of Sandra visiting my property after hours, photographing my charging station, and even measuring distances to prepare formal violation notices. Each visit was a trespass, and each interaction with the lock was technically tampering with my property. But the most valuable footage was what I captured of Sandra's response to being covered in pink paint. While she was screaming about assault and criminal charges, she was also trying to remove the lock that she'd installed without authorization. The cameras clearly showed her attempting to destroy evidence of her own illegal actions, while simultaneously demanding that police arrest me for defending my property. It was perfect documentation of Sandra's mindset. Rules applied to everyone except her, and any resistance to her authority was automatically criminal. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Sandra's ex-husband, who'd moved to Arizona after their divorce 2 years earlier, reached out after hearing about the paint incident through mutual friends. He provided copies of financial documents that showed Sandra had been planning the Glen Haven grant scheme since before she'd even moved to the community. She'd specifically targeted HOA president positions as a way to gain access to community funds and grant opportunities, and Glen Haven was just the latest in a series of communities where she'd tried similar schemes. By the end of that week, Rachel and I had assembled a comprehensive case that showed Sandra Crawford wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was a career fraudster who specialized in exploiting environmental programs for personal gain. The evidence was overwhelming, legally sound, and absolutely damning. Sandra's days of terrorizing Glen Haven were numbered, but we knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. The final confrontation was going to be spectacular, and this time, the entire community would be watching. The community meeting that would end Sandra Crawford's reign of environmental terror was held on a Thursday evening in Glen Haven's community center, and it drew the largest crowd in the HOA's history. Word had spread through the neighborhood that Rachel and I had uncovered something significant about Sandra's activities, and residents who'd never attended an HOA meeting before were suddenly very interested in community governance. The room was packed with 83 of Glen Haven's 87 households represented, plus several people I didn't recognize who turned out to be reporters from local news stations. Sandra entered the meeting looking like someone who was trying very hard to project confidence while secretly panicking. She'd managed to get most of the pink paint out of her hair, though there were still faint magenta highlights that caught the light when she moved. Her usual clipboard was replaced with a thick folder of documents, and she was accompanied by a man in an expensive suit, who introduced himself as her attorney. The battle lines were clearly drawn before the meeting even started. The agenda Sandra had prepared focused on resident safety violations and the need for enhanced community security protocols. She wanted to use the paint incident as justification for banning security cameras, motion sensors, and any other technology that could be used to resist her authority. But parliamentary procedure in Glen Haven allowed any resident to request amendments to the agenda, and I had prepared extensively for this moment. I requested time to present evidence of financial irregularities and selective rule enforcement in HOA. Sandra tried to shut down my request, claiming that financial matters weren't appropriate for general community meetings, but her own HOA bylaws specifically required transparency in all community governance issues. When several other residents supported my request and her attorney quietly advised her not to appear obstructionist, Sandra had no choice but to allow the presentation. She probably thought I was just going to complain about the charging station lock and the unfair fines. She had no idea what was coming. I started with a simple timeline showing the escalation of Sandra's environmental rules over the past 18 months. Each new restriction was mapped against the state grant application timeline, showing how Sandra had systematically manufactured compliance with grant requirements by imposing increasingly arbitrary rules on Glen Haven residents. Correlation was obvious and damning. Sandra's environmental extremism wasn't driven by ecological concerns, but by her desire to qualify the community for state funding that she planned to control. The drone footage of Sandra's property was the first major bombshell. Projected on the community center's large screen, the aerial images clearly showed Sandra's mesh router network. Her forbidden solar panels, her banned LED lighting systems, and her prohibited smart home technology. Every item was something she'd forced other residents to remove while keeping it for herself. The contrast between Sandra's public environmental rhetoric and her private technology use was visually stunning and impossible to deny. Rachel followed with the legal analysis, presenting documentation of Sandra's systematic, selective enforcement of HOA rules. She showed emails where Sandra had demanded removal of residents' security cameras while installing her own surveillance system. Financial records proved that Sandra had been collecting fines for violations of rules that she herself was breaking. The pattern was so consistent and so obviously intentional that it constituted a clear case of discrimination and abuse of power. But the real knockout punch was the state grant application itself. When Rachel displayed Sandra's funding request on the screen, showing her proposed $150,000 annual salary and her fabricated community testimonials, the room erupted in angry voices. Residents who'd been forced to remove beloved decorations or useful appliances realized they'd been manipulated to help Sandra qualify for a massive payday that they'd never been told about. The environmental committees and assessment protocols that had caused so much stress and expense didn't exist except as props in Sandra's grant application theater. Sandra's attempt at damage control was a masterclass in failed public relations. She claimed that the grant money would benefit the entire community, conveniently ignoring the fact that she'd planned to control most of it through her coordinator position. She insisted that her personal technology was necessary for her HOA president duties, which directly contradicted her own environmental policy. When residents started asking pointed questions about the fake committees and fabricated testimonials, Sandra's attorney began advising her to remain silent, which only made her look more guilty. The most damaging testimony came from Glen Haven residents themselves. Jerry stood up and detailed how Sandra had forced him to remove his ceiling fan while asking for his help installing similar equipment at her house. Martha Henderson described being fined for LED lights while Sandra's property featured the same technology. One by one, residents shared stories of Sandra's hypocrisy and selective enforcement, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse that had been going on for over 2 years. The financial evidence Rachel presented was equally devastating. HOA maintenance contracts had been inflated by companies that paid Sandra under-the-table commissions. Community improvement projects had been delayed or canceled so Sandra could accumulate funds for her personal use. The daily fines that Sandra had imposed on multiple residents generated thousands of dollars in revenue that went directly into accounts she controlled. Glen Haven's residents had been subsidizing Sandra's fraud scheme through their HOA fees and punitive fines. When it came time for a formal vote, the result was overwhelming. 81 residents voted to immediately remove Sandra as HOA president, with only Sandra herself and 2 residents who hadn't been paying attention voting to keep her in office. A second vote to pursue criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement passed by an even wider margin. The community also voted to rescind all of Sandra's environmental rules, pending review by actual environmental scientists rather than fake committees. Sandra's final act as HOA president was to storm out of the meeting while shouting threats about lawsuits and appeals. Her attorney stayed behind to apologize to the community and distance himself from what he called actions that were taken without proper legal consultation. The contrast between Sandra's dramatic exit and her lawyer's professional damage control made it clear that she was now completely on her own, facing both criminal charges and civil lawsuits without institutional support. Rachel was elected as interim HOA president, with a mandate to reform Glen Haven's governance structure and ensure that future HOA leadership would be transparent and accountable. Her first official act was to approve my Tesla charging station and refund all the fraudulent fines that Sandra had collected. Jerry got permission to reinstall his ceiling fan, Martha could use her LED lights again, and residents throughout Glen Haven began the process of reclaiming their homes from Sandra's environmental dictatorship. The aftermath was swift and satisfying. Within 2 weeks, Sandra had moved out of Glen Haven entirely, facing criminal charges in 2 counties and civil lawsuits from multiple residents. The State Environmental Agency launched an investigation into grant fraud that eventually led to stricter oversight of community funding programs. Local news coverage of the Pink Paint HOA became a cautionary tale about unchecked authority and the importance of community oversight in residential governance. My charging station still works perfectly, and I've helped several other Glen Haven residents install their own electric vehicle infrastructure as part of the community's new, legitimate environmental initiatives. The paint bomb system has been deactivated and removed, though I kept the Arduino controller as a memento of the most satisfying engineering project I've ever completed. Sometimes creative resistance is the only way to expose institutional corruption, and sometimes a splash of bright pink paint is exactly what a community needs to see the truth about their leadership. The real victory wasn't just stopping Sandra Crawford. It was showing Glen Haven's residents that they didn't have to accept arbitrary authority disguised as environmental responsibility. True environmental stewardship requires community cooperation and scientific integrity, not authoritarian control and financial fraud. Sandra's downfall became a powerful reminder that when someone wraps personal gain in the flag of environmental protection, the best response might just be a well-engineered burst of UV reactive paint and the courage to stand up for what's actually right.